Good evening, everyone. Good morning, depending on wherever you are. Uh, so, in case you're joining a first principle session for the first time, I'll just quickly give you a brief about what it is. So, it's a product webinar series run by Gojek to host experts like Nikitha today to learn from their mistakes and learnings. Yeah, we have a group on Meetup, of which I'll share the link in the chat. Please feel free to join the community. Uh, we share resources there, like the video recordings later on, and we announce the events, whatever we are doing there first. We are super excited to host Nikitha, who has a lot of interesting things to share with us. Thank you for taking out the time and joining us today, Nikitha. Uh, it's super early morning for her, so we are really grateful that she could take out the time and do this. A little bit about Nikitha. She is currently a product manager at VMware and is based out of San Francisco. She has experience in product management with both B2B and B2C companies. Uh, I'll hand it over to her to give more details. One thing about, so I'll just quickly run through how we'll conduct the session. If you have any questions, please drop them through Q&A. Nikita's presentation is about 40-45 minutes. Once the presentation is done, most of the questions which we got through the registration would be answered through the presentation itself. During the presentation, whichever questions you have, just drop it through Q&A. And once the presentation's over, in the last 15 minutes, we'll do the Q&A. So that's about it. Over to you, Nikita.
Yeah, thanks, Ayush. Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Nikitha. As Ayush mentioned, I'm a product manager at VMware. I'm based out of San Francisco, California, and it's just about starting to get bright here. So that's nice in terms of lighting. But anyway, so the topic today, as you might have seen, is B2B versus B2C product management. And in this talk today, I think we're going to cover the topics listed here. Just want to give you a really brief overview to set context of what my professional journey has been like, and then we can walk through kind of my takeaways from starting out in B2C, moving to B2B, what that was like, what the differences have been like, and maybe some recommendations as to what the right path might be for you. I also know there were questions about making the transition from one type of product management to another, so I'll go briefly into that and then just end with some of the common PM tips that I've learned along the way. So I'll aim to finish all of this in about 40 minutes, and so we can have a dedicated 15 minutes in the end for questions. With that, let's get started. So I think there's a pretty common notion of what people think careers look like and what they actually end up looking like. And mine was definitely the image on the bottom, right? So right after I graduated college, got an engineering degree like many people did, and although did not do anything related to my actual degree, decided to become a software engineer at a product startup based out of India. So did that for about 2 years and found that coding didn't come really that naturally to me. And this was actually a B2C company. So we were building products for startups based out of the US primarily. So this was an interesting brush into B2C because I got to work with different clients and understand what different business models look like. And so it gave me a unique insight into how building products really works. And I was starting to get the feeling that, coding and being a software engineer wasn't necessarily my path. And so at that time, really, product management was just starting to become a well known function. And it took a lot of research for me to figure out exactly what this role meant and what transferable skills from being an engineer I could bring to the table as a PM. And so it took a lot of interviewing, a lot of preparation to completely switch from engineering to product management without really having an MBA at the time or any other degree. And I finally managed to switch to a travel-based startup out of India as well. And that really was as B2C as you could get. And that was kind of learning from the fire hose for me because I hadn't had any product management experience in the past. It was a startup, and so things were rapidly changing. Um, I really enjoyed that experience. It was the scrappiest product management experience you could get. But as I will go through later, B2C PM is already so unstructured that it was very hard for me to learn. The learning curve in the beginning was pretty steep. Anyway, so after I spent about a year at this travel startup, I did a brief stint at the gaming company Zynga. Again, very B2C, but a very different type of B2C. But again, a lot of really good learnings from there. Then got an MBA from UCLA, during which I did several internships, mostly at B2C companies, again, I would say. So that was interesting for me because going from B2C in India to B2C in the US is, again, a slightly different experience. And finally ended up here where I am at VMware, which is as B2B as you can get. So I've had the full gamut of experiences, and I think that's given me an interesting perspective on what product management looks like at these types of companies. All my dabbling has helped me kind of help other people make that transition, and that's hopefully what I hope to bring to you today. So some of the B2C PM takeaways at a glance, and we'll go into each of these in slightly more detail, but I think these are the things that I learned the hard way. So the first thing is, understanding the product is easy. And actually, this was one of the things I learned the easy way because, as you might know, B2C products are pretty commonly known to most people, right? Like these are products that we use and engage with on a day-to-day basis. We essentially know how they work. There's nothing super complicated in how they function, at least from the outside. So it's easy to put yourself in the shoes of the user. Your grandma kind of knows what you do, at least if not your grandma, your parents know what you do. They understand what the company does. And there's brand awareness. People know what it is. So in that sense, I feel like B2C PM, the initial curve of learning what the product is, what the product does, how users use it is fairly straightforward. Um, the second thing, though, is that B2C users tend to be very fickle, and that's because they are consumers like you and me. So our tastes change, our tastes vary over time, and not everything is going to be easily accepted by every user. So there was a recent redesign of Facebook, I would say probably in late 2018, early 2019. And every time there's a major redesign of a consumer app, you will always find that people complain, and people complain loudly. It doesn't matter whether it was a good redesign, a bad redesign, why they did the redesign, but people will complain. And so this is one of those things about B2C is that you're always at the whims of the user. And that's a good thing to keep you honest. It keeps you on your toes. Companies really have to make sure they're ahead of the curve. But the problem with that is as a PM, you're always kind of frustrated whether things are not going your way. So something that worked in the past may not work in the future, right? You never know with people. So even for me personally, like when I was at Zynga, we would spend years and years in game development and not really understand like why some games would click and some games wouldn't click. Like it's really hard to predict. So, you would have something like Angry Birds that was made in a month become one of the top grossing apps on the App Store, but then a game that we had worked on for 2 years would flop. So it was really hard to say. And, sometimes things are out of your control in B2C PM. The next thing that I want to talk about is how UX is everything. So in B2C PM, everything that you create is going to be used by a user who may not be an expert in technology. In some cases, they might be, but in most cases, they may not be, which means that how you design the user experience to be simple and easy and understandable is really what drives the growth of your product. And this one example that I want to cite here is that, everyone's familiar with the Snapchat disappearing stories, or at least, if you grew up around the same time. And I knew about the feature. I was a Snapchat user, but unfortunately, it just really wasn't sticky for me because the user interface was intentionally made complex because they were designing for a different type of user. But as a result of that, there were not many users because that was a really niche audience. And Snapchat eventually didn't get to its goal of, outgrowing Instagram. So Instagram now has twice as many, users as Snapchat does. And not just Instagram individually, Instagram stories in particular, which is, the most comparable to Snapchat. And as most people know, Instagram stories is kind of a duplicate of Snapchat stories. They really didn't do much there. But then the UX is everything, right? Snapchat stories were hard to figure out. No one knew where they were, how to do it, what they meant. But Instagram, on the other hand, has made it very, very easy. And it's a common part of most people's Instagram journey. So in that sense, like UX is everything. They didn't come up with a, really innovative new feature. They just pretty much replicated a feature that already exists, but did it in a way that was really easy for users to consume and understand. This one is more general. I would call it like keep up with the pace or get left behind. And what I mean by this is B2C consumer PM and the industry as a whole just tends to move really quickly. And as you can see here, right, these are the three common home entertainment systems or home assistants, as you might call them, that we see today. So Google, Amazon, all of them are competing on the same front. All the devices more or less have the same features, they look the same, but they're competing on very minor things that may or may not be recognized by the average customer. But that's the point of B2C PM, is that if you don't have every single feature that your competitor has, or you don't have something that's setting you apart, then you will get left behind. And the pace of development is happening very quickly. And this is typical for B2C companies because users want something as soon as they see it. So if your competitor has it, you have to keep up or you're going to fall behind. So we see this happening, in many spaces in B2C, and this home assistant is just one category of examples. Like I would say travel apps is one more category where things move rapidly. Social networks, especially during the time of Facebook, it didn't look like Facebook was going to be the clear winner until much more recently. And so it's really important that as a B2C PM, you're aware of all the trends that are happening around you, aware of how all the applications work, what features a competitor's app has. And if you don't keep up with that pace of development, you are going to get left behind. So the next one is you either win big or you lose big. And the interesting part about this is that sometimes it may not be in your control, but you have to make the big bets in order to make the big wins. And if you don't make the big bets, then you won't have any big wins. But I guess on the plus side, you won't have any big losses either. You're kind of, floating there in the middle. So my recommendation, at least for B2C PMs, is that you need to take that chance. And the reason is because the consequences are fairly lower compared to B2B PM, at least. There are not as many risks associated with experimentation. And it's a lot easier to kind of try out new features. You can just do a really quick A/B test to figure out if something works or not. But the potential of winning big, I think, should outweigh the risks of losing because the consequences are not as bad. And I want to kind of cite here, like, there's a lot of online travel OTAs, as we call them, online travel agents, as you can see on the screen here. And this is a very, very, very crowded market, right? And to this day, I mean, there's been a lot of consolidation happening. A lot of these companies listed here, the websites are actually owned by a common parent. But ultimately, there's no clear winner that's emerged. In fact, I would say the clearest winner that may have emerged is actually Google, because they have become the ones that are actually surfacing and providing all these travel recommendations. So now when you look up a hotel, first result you see is not actually a hotels.com or a TripAdvisor, it's usually Google. So before these companies could kind of, figure out what their go-to-market is and what their plan is long-term, Google beat them to the punch. And essentially that's because Google made a big bet on travel, and they have the unique advantage of being kind of the first layer in the funnel, and therefore they're profiting from that. So now all these companies pay a bunch of money to Google and SEO advertising to kind of show up in their search results. And my point here is that, none of these companies really won big. I guess they haven't lost big either, but they're kind of just, there. And so I expect there to be a lot more consolidation going forward. And travel industry as a whole, I think, is one that's very, very challenging, especially in this day and age. But even pre-COVID, it was a struggle. So that is it about B2C PM and some of my, very high level takeaways of what that was like. And so now moving into B2B PM takeaways. So really briefly, if I go through each one of them. So firstly, products can be complex, and you will see why and how. Keeping users and customers happy is hard. Keeping users happy hard is a challenge in itself. Keeping users and customers adds an additional layer of complexity. The third, customer support is everything. Four, unlike the normal notion that we hear very often of moving fast and breaking things, you can't do that as easily as you would do that in B2C PM because there are consequences, like I mentioned. And then lastly, one big customer is all it takes. B2C PM, you need at least a significant number of users for you to be called successful, because that's how B2C PM is measured. But B2B PM, all it takes is one. So let's kind of deep dive into each one of these areas. So products can be complex, and this one is one of those areas where, as you can see, VMware is a very large enterprise tech company. And what I've shown you here is only a snapshot of like 5 pages of products that we have listed on our website. So each line item here is an individual product. And that means that entire product suite has over 100 products, and each one is very complicated. Some of these products have been around for 15 to 20 years, which means there is a lot of features. The code base, the size of the code base is massive. And so there's just a lot of complexity associated with B2B PM. One is just a function of time, they've been around longer. The other is that a lot of features need to be supported well beyond what is common for B2C PM. So on Facebook, let's say you turn off a feature, it's fine. Users will complain for a week, but you're not bound contractually to the user. B2B PM, you build something, companies are using it, then it means you have to support it for whatever support period you agreed to. So in VMware, the support period typically tends to be from 5 to 7 years. So that means we cannot, before that time, actually deprecate any features, which means we always have to kind of keep considering future trade-offs versus what we've already done in the past. And so just in general, keeping the product up to date can be complicated. The next one I want to talk about, and also in just to add a quick note here about keeping users and customers happy. So, this product list and the number of products in this list are actually really, really good for our customers, because our customers are mainly CTOs and CIOs of Fortune 500 companies, and they want an integrated set of solutions that they can go take to their CEO and say, look, I've done my job. I've provided the company with all the tools it needs to be productive. I have a security product in here, I have a compute, I have a storage product, I have a networking product. So customers, in the sense, the people paying for the product, are happy. On the other hand, you have your users of the product, which in this case I will define as the employees that are working at these customers' sites. So the employees, on the other hand, are the ones that actually have to deal with the complexity of these products, right? Because they're the ones operating them. And let me tell you, installing, upgrading is kind of a nightmare if you don't do it right, because all these products have to be installed sequentially. There's an order to them. One bug in one product can affect another product. And so the users themselves are not very happy with this, 100 product list that we have. So this is one of those examples where the user has different motivations from the customer. And it's hard to keep both in mind when you're designing a product, because at the end of the day, you have to keep them both happy. So if you don't keep your customer happy, they're not going to purchase your product. But if you don't keep your user happy, they're not going to use the product and your customer isn't happy. So it's a hard line to walk, and sometimes it can be challenging. This is just one example, but there have been many cases of that over time in my career as a B2B PM. Okay, moving forward. So this is the magic quadrant for what cloud infrastructure looks like today. And this is mainly, companies that we talk about like AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft has its own version called Azure. So this is essentially the cloud, running services in the cloud. And as you can see here, Google is somewhere in the bottom of the topmost quadrant. And the reason for this is actually poor customer support. So in terms of technology, Google has always been one of the best, and they run Google search on their own Google Cloud. So they really know how to handle like huge volumes of, interactions, and their technology is kind of unparalleled in the industry. And yet they're still somehow doing poorly compared to Microsoft and Amazon. And if you look at market share, they are the third and probably may have slipped down to the fourth even. And it is commonly known in the space that it is because of their customer support. So people have found that it's really challenging to open support tickets with Google to get them to fix issues with Google Cloud. Google will kind of deprecate features and deprecate code bases without telling their users, which again leads to a lot of trouble for customers. And in general, that's not how enterprise support works. Like customer support has to be really robust. There has to be clear messaging and communication about when any changes will happen to the product, so your customers can prepare for any potential outages or downtime. And all of this requires a certain kind of thinking, which Google, just by its nature as a company, did not have. And so now it's developing that form of thinking, and they've realized their mistakes. And so they've hired Thomas Kurian, who is now leading their Google Cloud division. And the idea behind that is he comes from Oracle, and he brings a lot of that product-based, customer support focused thinking. And that's what they really need right now. So the point being here is that no amount of really great tech can save you if you don't have the right customer support in place, especially for enterprise B2B, because customers are paying for not only just the product, but a huge part of what they're paying for is the support associated with that. So on the point of can't move too fast and break things, that is a very valid point when you think about as a B2B enterprise, entire companies are running their business on you. And even if you're not a cloud provider like AWS, if you're providing essential services like an HR platform, an email service, any kind of outage can be really disruptive to the customers that you serve. And obviously, in this case, I've cited an example of AWS going down. Perhaps this wasn't intentional, but in other cases, I know that there were times when VMware decided to push a change, and VMware powers the software of many infrastructure providers, including banks and other financial services. So when VMware goes down, there's an entire banking or financial system in a country that can potentially go down. And so that's just a really scary consequence. And as a result, we are very careful anytime we introduced any new product, any new feature, make any changes. Security bugs, as soon as they're reported, get patched instantly. There's just no other higher priority than ensuring that our customers are running safely, and we cannot really do any kind of weird experiments. We cannot ship features without really thinking them through because it can have real dollar impact. So I think there was a number for how much money all of these companies together lost when AWS went down, and it was easily in the high millions, like 3-digit millions. So that's kind of what's at stake here. On the other hand, B2C PM is a lot more fun in that sense, where you can actually move fast and break things because it doesn't take that much to revert a change, right? You can make a change to a screen on an app, and if something disruptive happened, you can roll it back really quickly. Most of them are cloud-based and SaaS applications, so it's easy to do that. A lot of these companies are running, data centers, and their software cannot get patched on a day-to-day basis. It takes months, sometimes even years, to patch software. So that's kind of the difference that I had to really learn, because I was frustrated by how slowly things were going at my new role at VMware as a B2B PM, and it took some time for me to really internalize that this is not something that you can just play around with. You have to really keep in mind that customers are running essential services on top of your software. And finally, one big customer is all it takes. I think this was really interesting from Slack's S1 filing a while ago, where this particular line that I've highlighted here, that only 15% actually of customers were paying for Slack at the time. And of those paying customers, 575 paid more than 100,000 each. Everyone else was paying less than that. So overall, if you look at that stat, it says 0.1% of Slack's total customer base accounted for 40% of the company's revenue. And this number is actually, not that bad. I've heard much worse, where 70 to 80% of a company's revenue comes from one customer. But this is very, very common in B2B PM. And it's an interesting thing to note, because oftentimes one customer can drive your product roadmap entirely. And that just depends on how big your customer is. So this can make things both easier and difficult. Easier because unlike B2C PM, you're not collectively thinking about the needs of a few million users and trying to figure out what they want. All you have to do in this case is ask your one big customer, hey, what do you want? What's going to keep making you purchase our product and using our product? So in that sense, it takes a little bit of a shift in your thinking as to how you gather feedback, how you take input on your product roadmap, and how you grow from one customer to maybe 20 or maybe the first 1,000. So the scale of users in which you're thinking about is completely different as compared to B2C PM. So that is the differences and the takeaways for B2C and B2B. I think now I just want to, we may have heard some of this already as I was going over it, but I think I just want to briefly walk through what the key differences are from my perspective. And just want to note that I don't think anyone is made to be a B2C PM or a B2B PM at any given point of time, right? I think either role could be a good fit for you, depending on your own personal interests, depending on where you are in your career. So I just think it requires a slight change in mindset thinking when you move from one to the other. But I think either role could be a good fit for you depending on where you are. And so here I have 4 bullet points. The first being the differences: user versus customer, qualitative data versus quantitative, slower versus faster product release cycles, and well understood versus wild, wild west. So talking about the first one, as I made the point earlier, B2C products typically the revenue generation models are you either have a freemium model where your user and the customer are essentially the same because no one's really paying for it. And you have unless they decide to upgrade to a paid tier, in which case the user becomes the customer because they're now paying, but they're the same person, right? Free but ad supported. This is an interesting model. Most social networks today follow this model where the user is using the app for free, whereas the customers are your advertisers or companies advertising on the platform. So those folks are paying Facebook, for example, for using their platform as an advertising platform, but it's free for end users. So in this case, you have two different personas that you're building products for in a B2C product. And then for B2B, typically, or B2B to C, because eventually at the end of every software company, there is a user, whether or not that's B2B or B2C. Usually the model is paid, right? The company paying is usually the customer, and the employees who work at that company are the users. So these are pretty nuanced, takes on who the users are and who the customers are. And as a PM, I think we need to cater to both personas, even if the roles happen to be played by the same person. So that's just the key difference here. The roles in some cases might be played by the same person, in some cases different people, but thinking of it as personas is what really helped me make that clear distinction in my mind. And so there are many examples of this. I've already gone through some of them, so I won't spend too much time here. But I think the challenge here is just balancing your roadmap, especially on a B2B side, of how you can make both your user and your customer happy. And on the B2C side, how do you extract value from users without users feeling like they're being exploited, which is, as we all know, the social dilemma came out. People know that, if there is no way, if you're not paying for the product, then it's probably the fact is that you are the product, and people are wisening up to that. So I think we will slowly see an end to sort of this ad-based model. I think it's more viable for startups or SaaS companies to actually start charging their users a small amount of money versus moving completely to an ad-based model. But I think this is 10 to 15 or maybe even several more years out. But yeah, people are wisening up to the fact that if they're not paying for it, they're probably the product themselves. The next is qualitative data versus quantitative. So I think on the left, if you look at here, this is something we have inside of VMware. It's called AHA. I'm not sure how widely it's being used. I think companies are starting to use this more and more. But a lot of feedback that we collect is qualitative in nature. And that's because we have several customers that are very large that bring us, a significant chunk of our revenue. And so we end up talking to them more, and we take their feedback very seriously. And the way in which we collect it is we have them post their feedback onto this portal that only customers have access to. And customers can upvote or downvote each other's feature requests. And then as PMs, we evaluate the ones that are trending or very popular and respond to their feedback. And then if it's in our product roadmap already, we will indicate that. So you can see there's a status column on the left, whether it's in review, whether it's been rejected. And this tool, I think, is really helpful way for us to visualize the feedback that we're receiving. The one challenge always with getting feedback from large customers like this is people will always come to you not only with the problem, but also with the solution. And this is because for enterprise companies, when customers have been using your product for years, sometimes they think they're the experts. And in many cases, they are. But as someone who'd like recently joined VMware, for example, I was talking to customers who had been using the product for 10 years. They knew a lot more about the product than I did. So it was really challenging for me in the beginning to, not just take everything they said at face value and say, if they said, oh, build me X feature, not just go build X feature. It actually required me to think from first principles and figure out, okay, what is the problem here that they're really facing? And what is the solution to that problem? So separating those concerns is hard, especially when you have big customers kind of always in your ear. I don't use typically as much quantitative data as I use qualitative. And the reason for that is, well, for one, it is more challenging to collect data when you're an enterprise B2B company, because a lot of times companies don't want to give you all of their usage metrics. This is for, security concerns, and they just don't want other companies knowing how many transactions are happening within their company. And that's totally fair. And so there's firstly a limited subset of data we can collect. Mostly all the data is fully randomized and anonymized. And so there's not that much to go on. And then just, more broadly, there's fewer customers as a whole. So it's easier for us to just talk to customers directly instead of trying to infer their intentions using data. So I think that's a big thing about B2B is a lot of feedback tends to be on the more qualitative side. Whereas, B2C companies in the past have been very, very quantitative, the ones that I've worked for. I would say Zynga, the gaming company, is probably one of the best I've ever seen in terms of the infrastructure they have to build a data analytics platform. They had their own internal system built in. So PMs were required to kind of run SQL queries against this database. And they had a very, very scientific, rigorous method of how they would evaluate all of this data. Other B2C companies I know we typically use like Google Analytics, Mixpanel, various app native analytics tools and platforms that existed. And honestly, like there's no better way to get feedback if you're a B2C PM, primarily because you can't talk to every single user that's using your product. It wouldn't be representative of your entire user base. And then A/B testing and other forms of experimentation are much easier to do on B2C. So you get a lot of really good data from that in order to shape your product direction. So there's definitely room for both types of data. You just may tend to use one more than the other, depending on which side of PMing you're on. But obviously, without data, it's really hard to be a PM in any case. So the next one is slower versus faster release cycles. And I talked about this earlier, so I won't go too much into detail. But on B2B PMing, you cannot ship a product that barely works. You have to do a lot of extensive testing before you release anything. People are used to doing things a certain way. So you have a certain expectation of where your inbox might be in your email client and where you can find your saved drafts. If you suddenly change and move it around, that's a disruption to your workflow. So PMs have to be very careful in breaking habits. And support agreements with customers typically mean that you can't add and remove features as you wish. There has to be a process, there has to be communication much in advance, and then you have to document everything. So if it's not written in the docs, it may as well not exist to your customers. And documentation takes time, let me tell you, especially for large products like the ones that we ship. Documentation can be anywhere from 300 to 400 pages. So it's like a book for every version we ship. And that's kind of the nature of B2B products. B2C, on the other hand, I honestly still love the B2C model. If I could do it here, I would, but you can push 10 times, code 10 times a day, and nothing would really happen. Like users will tolerate the changes. It's easy to roll back anything if you want. There's a lot of room for experimentation and adaptation. And if you see a competitor release a feature earlier in the week, you could probably release a competing feature by the end if it's simple enough. And that to me, that flexibility and that speed is just not something that I've seen in B2B PM yet. Although I feel like that is changing a little bit, but you still have to consider all of the things that I mentioned earlier. And then finally, well understood versus Wild Wild West. So this tweet I thought was timely. Just yesterday on Twitter, the CEO of Box was commenting that, there's still so much opportunity in the enterprise space because a lot of business processes haven't really changed over the past decade or so. There's a lot of room for modernization still left. We thought web conferencing or like online video conferencing was over with Skype, but hey, who knew Zoom came around, right? So there's always room for improvement in the B2B space. And it's a well understood space because it's been around for such a long time. Businesses are risk averse, which usually means that these technology used in B2B changes much more slowly because usually customers have bought like multi-year contracts. So it's not like they can just, decide like, yeah, I don't feel like using you. Let me just, get a new one. You have to kind of wait it out. So there's a lot of expertise in this area. It's more predictable. The landscape changes much more slowly. Whereas on the other hand, like B2C PM, at any given point of time, right, there's probably like 30 apps in any given category and users have no loyalty. It's easy to switch. The cost of switching is very low. So it means you just have to kind of stay constantly on top of things, on top of trends, be very innovative. And it's just not as well understood of a space, which actually in my mind makes it very interesting and very challenging, but can also be very frustrating because it's hard to know what will work. It oftentimes just feels like luck. So yeah, that's kind of the overall differences that I see. between B2C and B2B PM. So let's briefly look at choosing the right path for you. And I don't think I'll go too much into this in detail because I think we've covered it, but just largely speaking, B2B PM tends to be more structured, has the optionality of career mobility because the B2B industry is fairly small, which means that you probably know other people in the field very quickly. So it's easier to move around, in my opinion. And the expertise you have can translate very well as well. It's easier to measure success because I can claim that, hey, the product that I shipped, the feature that I shipped, got us $100 million in revenue just based on sales. So it's easy to quantify big wins like that. Whereas on the B2C PM side, I think it's harder to do so. So I don't want to go into too much detail in the interest of time, but you will have a slide later. So I think you can refer to that if you're interested. And I will just briefly walk through making the transition from B2C to B2B. So overall, both of them are more similar than they're different. I know I spent a lot of time talking about how they're different, but in general, PM doesn't change that much, even regardless of the industry you're in. So B2C, B2B, whether it's software, whether it's hardware, the core skill set of a PM tends to stay the same. And PM skills are also very transferable. So I would say that you should just play to your strengths. If you started out in B2C PM, then it's possible that your design skills are very good because obviously you've been working really closely with UX. So that was the case for me. And when I went to VMware, I think I was one of the few PMs who had any sense of design and any sense of user experience. So I became known as like, hey, Nikita's the PM we should go to if we need help on designing screens because she's really good at it. So that's the skill I brought to the table by coming from B2C to B2B. Now, if you're someone trying to go from B2B to B2C, then you might have like more deeper technical expertise than your peers in consumer PM. And so I think all it really means is you need to identify what your strengths are from working in a particular space and kind of carry that over and play to your strengths in the new space that you're going to. During the interview process, obviously, and during your actual job itself, really helps to be familiar with the overall landscape. If you're unfamiliar with it, I know especially for folks that have been in one or the other for a very long time, we kind of lose sight of what's happening on the other side. Like I will keep up with B2B trends, but if you ask me like, what is the newest app doing food delivery, I might not know. So that's just something that you have to prep for if you are deciding to make the switch. And personally, I feel like making the switch earlier in your career is a lot easier, mainly because you haven't entrenched yourself too deeply, you haven't developed too much subject matter expertise, and it makes more sense narratively when you're speaking with recruiters. If I'd made the switch, let's say 10 to 15 years from now, it just feels like a lot of the technical niche expertise that I've developed would not be put to use. So I might find it harder to switch much later. Although in theory, it should still be possible. And multiple switches, I have seen a few people do it, not a lot, but going back and forth from B2B to B2C could be potentially detrimental if you do it too often. I would say start out, no one knows what they're doing in the beginning. Figure out in the first 5 to 10 years of career on which side of the fence you want to be. And for people who have equal knowledge in both, I know a lot of people go into investing and venture capital, and that's always an option too. It does make you a more well-rounded person to understand both sides. So I would definitely recommend making the switch at least once, but just be careful of the timing and try to limit the number of times you do it. And finally, the PM lessons and tips. So this is not specific to B2B or B2C PM. It's just general tips that I found very helpful for me. And I actually do write about these in a lot more detail on my blog, which is where most of these have been sourced from, plus a few extra ones. But the first one is maintain a work diary. And this actually is very similar to like a regular diary, a personal diary you might maintain. But essentially what you're doing is logging what you did during the day. This helps you not only maintain a record of this for the future, but keeps you accountable for your time and keeps you accountable to promises you've made to other people. So if you've said in a meeting that I will send out a follow-up meeting for next week, if you don't actually follow through on that action, it just makes you look like you are a bad PM, at least over time, if you repeat that. So I think one of the main attributes of a successful PM are they always follow up and they always make sure to clearly lay out what the next steps are. And I know in the beginning it was really hard for me to do that because I had like 10 meetings a day, and it was hard for me to keep track of like what I did in every meeting, what the next steps would be. And so maintaining this diary was a way of kind of documenting all of that. And I still have it to this day, and it's still very useful. So I would highly recommend that. The second one is don't hold meetings or call for meetings without an agenda or some type of shared document. So what I would recommend is kind of seed a page that's empty. Maybe it's a conference, maybe it's a Word doc. Uh, just have a brief outline of like, this is the topic we're going to discuss, and these are the people who are going to be attending. During the meeting itself, type up notes in the same document. After the meeting, send the document out. So this serves all the functions of, having an agenda for your meeting. You are able to take notes in real time, capture action items so that people can see as it's being written. They know what they have to do. You're sending it out after the meeting in lieu of meeting notes. So you don't have to write three different things 3 different times. It's all in one place, and it's easy for people to see. So this has worked really well for me. And I think people happen to think I'm very organized, which I'm actually really naturally not. But this is one of those life hacks where like it makes you look really, really organized. The third one, document everything in Jira, tool of your choice. I know people will like literally catch me in the hallways or ping me on Slack or email saying, hey, it would be cool to have X, Y, and Z feature. Half the time, I'm going to forget it. So what I do now is I immediately plug it into Jira. So I have a ticket sitting there somewhere in my backlog. I know I can prioritize it in the future, even if I don't want to do it right now. And I know who actually gave me the idea, so I can follow up with them when I need to. Not doing this at that moment just means that it goes somewhere into the black void of space, and someone asks you about it 2 months later, you have no idea what they said. So this is a really good way for me to keep track of all the feature ideas I'm getting. The fourth is keep all stakeholders involved in the loop early. So as a PM, you're typically working with many, many cross-functional teams. And I found that it's best to involve them earlier than later, like as soon as the inception phase of your feature or your product. And the reason for that is not only do you get really valuable feedback from various stakeholders, they also really feel invested in the process. And one thing that it also does, it helps you cover your ass in the sense that, later when people come and say 3 months after product development, like, hey, I don't think this feature is a good idea. And if that person is a very senior engineer, your feature is essentially, off the rails. So it helps me to really involve people early, just so I know that everyone's on the same page. If they had any objections, they should have said it in the beginning. Otherwise, 3 months down the line, it's too late. So that's kind of where that came from. Number 5, pick a prioritization method or framework, communicate it, and stick to it. So there's many models for prioritization. There's the RICE model or the Kano model, both of which I follow. I would say it doesn't matter which one you pick as long as you know it really well and then you actually stick to it and communicate that with your team. So a lot of times for PMs, I know it becomes a war of opinions about like which feature we should prioritize. So having a framework behind it really helps. And if you also tell your team what that framework was and that you're consistently applying the same framework, they actually build more trust in you. And so this is something that I've learned again the hard way, but I find that having a method, a scientific method, it's much more easy than battling out like based on I think and he thinks. The sixth one, have an overview deck ready for your product or feature area. There have been so many times where someone's new to the team, new to the project, or some new manager joins, new CTO joins, and I have to explain what I'm doing. So it always helps for me to have a few slides handy that I've prepped beforehand, that I keep adding to as time progresses, so that I have something that I can show people whenever they ask me. So it walks through kind of why we're investing in this area, what is the competitive landscape, what are the feature roadmap, what is the long-term vision. So just 5 or 6 slides that communicate what your product is. Number 7, I think as a PM, I found the only way to really, really be successful is to cultivate relationships and build trust. So be friendly, be approachable, understand people's motivations, give more than you take. So, and this is not something that you do right before you need something, right? It can't be transactional. Over time, you need to build that relationship with your functional stakeholders, and they need to know that they can trust you. So you need not be the most analytical PM or the most talented PM or the most skillful PM. I think people who are actually nice and liked and people trust tend to do better than PMs that are, geniuses in any one of those areas. And that's something that I've just seen repeatedly. And then finally, whether you're a B2C PM or a B2B PM, I think you need to be relentless about learning. PMs are expected to be the voice of the customer and the voice of the user. So you need to know their problems before they know they are going to have that problem. And that means just keeping up with the industry, keeping up with new technological advancements, keeping up with what other options your users have on the table. If not your product, what product are they going to use and why? And bringing back all of this insight to your engineering team, your design teams, and making sure they know what's happening out in the world. So you have to be that messenger between the outside world and the inside world. And that would really make you a successful PM. So with that, I think I'm a few minutes over what I promised, but we can now open for questions.
Sure. Thanks, Nikita. That was really insightful. A lot of great insights in there. Okay, I'll start with the questions. Starting with the most common ones which have got received so far. How difficult was the transition from an engineer to being a product manager? And yeah, between B2B and B2C, you have touched upon on it already. If you want to add something there as
Yeah.
well.
So engineer to product manager was not easy. I will say that. I think I was, first of all, not an engineer for that long. So it wasn't like I had 5 years of engineering experience and tried to be a PM. I knew pretty early on that I wanted to switch. So I would say it took me more or less 8 months to make the switch. Or maybe I knew I learned about PM around the 8 month mark, and around the six month mark was when I was actually actively applying. So I think what really helped me was just educating myself, a lot of reading about product. There were a lot of great blogs back then. So I was educating myself constantly, kind of writing myself. I found that writing is a good way of signaling to potential employers your skill set and what you're thinking about and what your frameworks are. And that's something that I've learned to do over time. So if you're able to write, I would say write, read as much as you can. There's a lot of resources out there. I would also say that it takes time. So you have to kind of put the feelers out, talk to people, network, meet other PMs in the space, and get in through that route. It can be challenging. I would also say for that first switch you're trying to make, try not to focus too much about like what company is it, how big is it, which industry is it in. Because I think getting that first PM on your resume is the biggest hurdle. So I really didn't care whether it was, I don't know, an e-commerce company or like a payments company or some other type of company. I was very agnostic about the industry. I just was like, I need to be a PM. I don't care which company it is. As long as it's a good role, right? I don't mind. So I would suggest don't be too picky in the beginning about what type of company you're going to be at. Just look for PM roles, and startups are a great place for that because they're more likely to give you a chance than a well-established company.
Perfect. Okay, adding on to that, for those who are looking to make the switch, the aspirants, are there any blogs, any books, any websites, any other practices that you'd like to recommend?
Yeah, and because this is actually a bad format to tell you all that, there's an article on my blog that I've written explicitly for this purpose that I can maybe drop into the chat, or we can send out after the call.
Yeah.
So that has, I think, my favorite resources that I use even till this date. And then I also have another one about like breaking into technical product management if you're not technical, and that might be of interest too.
Perfect. Adding on to that, okay, so there were a lot of questions. There were a couple of questions saying, is an MBA needed to enter into product management? For those also, I'd like to say there's a whole blog which Nikita has written on a website. Please do go there and check that out. That would answer all of those questions.
Yeah, but just so I don't keep plugging people to the website, but I would say an MBA is helpful but not necessary, is the short summary. So if you are in the time and place of your life where an MBA makes sense for you in terms of, financially and otherwise, then, and if it's always been something you've wanted to do, I would say do it. If the only purpose of doing an MBA is I want to become a PM, then I would say that other easier ways in which you can do that.
Perfect. Okay, moving on to other questions. There are a couple of questions around how the product roadmaps and life cycles different between B2B and B2C, which you answered with the pace compared in the both of the industries.
Yeah.
I think else
Um,
like to add, yeah.
Right. So I think that's a really good question. And I would say that in B2B PM, typically, because the development cycles are longer, we're thinking much further ahead. So at any point of time, we might be thinking about features that are 3 to 5 years out. And I'll give you one example of this in my case, which is we've recently been working with NVIDIA GPUs, and NVIDIA had informed us about the new GPUs that were coming up several years in advance because we all need to work in lockstep in order to ship the feature together. So if VMware needs to provide NVIDIA GPUs on its platform, that's something that starts like 5 years pre the actual release of the product. So that's how long our roadmap is. B2C products, I think the landscape changes so quickly that, something that's 3 years out will quickly become out of date. And so that's not how far we do it. So I would say it's more like 3 to 6 months on the B2C side, more like 2 to 5 years on the B2B side, at least the type of company that I work for. It could be smaller for other types of companies, but that's typically the difference between the two.
Perfect. Okay. Another interesting question. It says, how much of qualitative data should we need ideally? I feel qualitative data is always limited, and we may have ended up interacting with only a few customers who have a particular bias. So, how do you balance between data and intuition, basically?
Yeah. I think it's a tough one, really. So obviously, you go into any situation with some type of hypothesis, right? You have an opinion on what you think might happen, and data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, is meant to prove or disprove that. So a lot of times, I think when you speak to a certain number of customers, you start hearing the same thing over and over again, and this can be a little misleading if you're talking to a very similar type of customer. So you may want to sample very carefully of who you're speaking with and make sure you're covering every segment. But I found after a critical point, you start to hear the same thing over and over. And that's when you know that that's probably what the pain point is. So it's a little bit of intuition, yes, because you kind of know what you expect to hear. But let's say it turns out to be the exact opposite. You know that's true if enough people are saying it. So for qualitative data, I would say that choose your customers that you're talking to carefully. Make sure there's a good representation across size, stage of the company, any other factors that might be relevant to you, and make sure you're getting equal opinions from all of them, and then weigh those very carefully. And if they completely go against your initial hypothesis, be a little wary. It could be a flaw in the data because usually as PMs, I would trust our gut. There may be times when you're wrong, but I would say there are far fewer times when you're wrong. Most of the time, you're right. So just be a little cautious if something goes entirely opposite of what you were expecting.
Perfect. Okay. Another question on similar lines that you mentioned that there might be one big customer in B2B who, so how do you balance while making a roadmap? How do you ensure that you're not making the roadmap too dependent on that one based
Yeah.
on one big customer? And
It's really hard because it's very easy to be swayed by that type of pressure because one customer is really hounding you for something. I think where this it really helps to have strong leadership. So when it's coming from like your boss or your CEO or whoever it is that's setting the strategy for the company, they need to have this forward looking vision in mind where they know that today this customer is 80% of their revenue, but the ideal goal is in 5 years this customer should be only 20% of the revenue. You don't want all your revenue concentrated in one customer. It's dangerous. So if they are of that opinion and you have their support, or you present this opinion in that way to them, then I think it should be a very conscious effort. Like we know this customer provides 80% of our revenue, but we're not going to let them drive our roadmap. If we'll keep them happy enough, but we're not going to keep them happy to the point where we're spending all our engineering resources servicing this one company. So it just means you're making a very conscious effort of the split of features and time you're spending for this one customer. And sometimes features you build for one customer may be widely applicable to a bunch of customers. So I always play this trick where, if a customer asks me for something, I will modify it slightly to make it more universally applicable. And they're usually pretty happy with that because they're like, oh, they took my input. Like they're giving me what I want, but it's slightly different, but that's okay. So that's usually how I do it.
great. Okay. Okay, here's another interesting question. For a B2B enterprise focused startup, which one is a better approach? Find a big customer, build everything they want, and move on to the next customer, or keep releasing features as you build with smaller companies and then start selling to a big business? Which one makes more sense?
Oh, that's a really good one. I don't think you can go wrong either way. I'm sure companies have been successful doing both. Um, what I've seen a lot happening, especially as I've been reading about how, Slack and Zoom and other companies like that got their start, it seems like they usually start with a wider net. So they seem to, put the product into the hands of as many people in their network as possible, get them to start using it. So Slack started that way, where a bunch of startups in the Bay Area started using it internally and gave them a lot of feedback. And then they incorporated that feedback, which in turn led to them getting their larger customers just through kind of word of mouth and the network effect. But in general, I would say it seems to make more sense to cast a wider net in the beginning and not just focus on one customer, at least in the first, I would say, 1 year, because you get a better idea of like, what is the feature set that customers across a wide range of sizes and industries are asking for? Like, what is my product market fit? And I think you get a better sense of that when you're talking to more customers versus kind of narrowing on one in the beginning. Because then, if you go down the wrong track there, that's kind of the end of it for you. Whereas on the other hand, if you're talking to multiple sets of customers across a range of industries, you're getting insights from multiple places. And so you have a better sense of where your product actually fits. So for me, I think if I were making that decision, probably I would do that. But, it really depends. I don't think you can go wrong either way.
Correct. Okay. Another question says, with slow release cycles, is it difficult to apply agile methodology? So, how do you work with that?
Um, yes, we follow some weird hybrid of like a waterfall slash agile, where we're waterfall for a quarter, like a financial quarter, because we plan what we're going to ship for a good 3 months at the beginning. Within the quarter, how engineers kind of do those things is agile. So that's how we operate. It's very hard to be agile because you kind of need to know when products are shipping, because you promise features to customers by a specific time period. So you have to commit to those.
Okay.
And it's harder to be agile when you're doing that. So also, we are not a SaaS service. So that makes it even harder to be agile. Um, so I would say a lot of the newer B2B SaaS companies are agile. For them, it's relatively straightforward. It might be over a larger time period. So instead of like maybe 2 weeks, it's a month, but it's possible to do it. We just haven't gotten there yet.
Got it. Okay, we'll just take last two questions. What measurement do you use for feature prioritization for a B2B product? So how do
Yeah.
you?
So I don't think it actually varies that much between B2C and B2B, because the way in which you measure those things might be different, but the measures themselves are the same. So the one model that I talked about is the RISE model, and RISE stands for reach, impact, confidence, and effort. So it's a score that you calculate. Reach is how many people this feature might potentially reach. Impact is how important is it to them? Like, is it a small feature that's like, yeah, it'll improve their life a little bit, or is it like game changer? So that's the impact. Confidence is like, how confident are you in your estimates of R and I? Because at the end of the day, they're estimates. Some things you might be more sure about, some things less. And E is effort, which is how much engineering time is needed to be spent on this. So the four together gives you a number. And if you're the same person doing it, I would assume there's some consistency across features. And so you can rank them accordingly. So this doesn't have anything specific to B2C or B2B. It's pretty much the same across. So that's something I use personally. There's a lot out there. I would just suggest pick one that makes more sense to you and you find easy to remember.
Perfect. Okay. Uh, Last question. Someone has asked, isn't B2B PMing more like project management, considering there is little purview over sales and marketing? So,
Hmm. It's a good question. I would say no. And the reason is because, like at larger companies, there is a program manager and a product manager. Program managers tend to do more of the project management work. Product managers are just core focused on the product. And I actually do talk with sales and marketing a lot, because once you kind of develop your product or your feature, you have to work with the sales team to figure out like, how are we going to sell this thing? What kind of support do our sales engineers need? What are the key value props that we should bring out to the field? Similarly with marketing, like what kind of documentation are we going to write? What kind of webinars will we hold? finance teams, how should we price this product? Like finance teams have the financial expertise, but they don't know the technical differences between my product and Amazon's product or Google's product. So I have to be the one that's communicating, like, these are the deltas, this is the improvements we've made, and this is what we should charge for that. So it's not true that there's less involvement. In fact, I would say there's a lot of involvement, because B2B actually involves like really integrated sales, marketing, finance pipelines, which may not be the case for all B2C companies.
Got it. Okay. Okay. With that, we'll wrap it up, Nikita. Thanks again for taking out the time. This was really wonderful. A lot of great insights. For others, the questions which we couldn't take, please feel free to connect with Nikita offline. Do check out her blog. A lot of really good insights in there too, which would answer a lot of your questions. There'll be a small feedback form which will appear on a window once we end the webinar. Please do take out 2 minutes to fill that up so that we can improve uh, the next ones. Okay, with that, we'll end it. Thank you so much, Nikita.